monthly council meeting of Flaxborough Town Council had always possessed the reassuring predictability of a metronome. Every second Thursday the town hall would fill with the modest rustle of papers, the occasional cough from a weary councillor, and the discreet clink of teacups on saucers. Nothing in this quiet routine suggested that a murder, or even the faintest hint of criminality, could lurk among the minutes, agendas, and polite applause for routine motions. On this particular afternoon, the air was tinged with the faint, lingering scent of varnish from the newly polished council table, a touch that pleased the chairman, Mr. Philip Whitcomb, whose pride in small improvements often exceeded the public significance of their results. Mrs. Eleanor Tilling, local historian and council clerk, fussed over her papers with a mixture of anticipation and mild anxiety, as though the precise alignment of her documents might somehow stave off misfortune. Inspector Purbright, as was his custom, had arrived punctually but unobtrusively, settling into the back row where his presence would be acknowledged only by the keenest eye. He observed the councillors assembling with a calm scrutiny that suggested, rather than proclaimed, authority. There was the mayor nodding at a photograph of the town's war memorial, and Councillor Vernon, whose spectacles perpetually threatened to slide off his nose. Even the janitor, Mr. Beasley, who was sweeping with a diligence that bordered on obsession, seemed aware of a subtle tension in the room. The meeting commenced with the usual formalities, apologies for absence, brief announcements, and a review of the previous minutes. Then came the discussion of a proposed increase in the annual allotment fees, a matter of mild concern that quickly devolved into a heated debate about compost quality and the encroachment of nettles on neighbouring plots. Yet, as voices rose in polite dissent, the room experienced a minor disturbance that went unnoticed by everyone but Purbright. A faint rustling, almost imperceptible, had come from the end of the table nearest the exit door. Purbright's attention flicked there. He saw nothing at first, only the nervous adjustment of Mr. Vernon's spectacles. Then, with a quiet thump, something slid onto the polished floor. It was a single sheet of paper smudged with a faint stain of something indeterminate. The clerk bent to retrieve it, murmuring a brief apology, but the content of the page was unmistakably the council minutes from the last meeting, except that several lines had been meticulously erased and rewritten in a shaky hand. A collective murmur rippled through the council. Mrs. Tilling looked flustered. "I must have misplaced this," she stammered, although the paper had clearly not been misplaced in the usual sense. Councillor Vernon's spectacles caught the overhead light, and for a moment his eyes flickered with what Purbright recognized as the delicate anxiety of someone caught between surprise and calculation. Perhaps it simply fell from the stack, the mayor suggested, in a tone intended to soothe. Yet the slight crease across the middle of the sheet, as though someone had pressed it into a deliberate fold, and the irregular ink blotches suggested otherwise. Purbright made no immediate remark. He merely observed. The rustling ceased, the council resumed its discussion, but an undercurrent of suspicion had settled like a shadow over the room. He noticed small details. The way Councillor Whitcomb avoided eye contact with the clerk, the careful attention of a young assistant who seemed eager to clear the table of distractions, and the subtle twitch of Mr. Beasley's hand as he adjusted the broom handle. By the end of the meeting, the amended minutes had been restored to the clerk's folder, and the council adjourned, leaving the town hall with its usual sense of unfinished business. But for Inspector Purbright, the incident was significant enough to warrant a mental note. There had been no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, and certainly no threat of immediate danger, yet a minor disruption, so understated as to seem almost trivial, had already revealed fissures beneath the surface of the council's placid exterior. As he left the hall, Purbright reflected on the curious human habit of concealment. People, he thought, had an extraordinary capacity to disguise their intentions behind civility, to transmute misdeeds into mundane accidents. A single, smudged sheet of paper could be more telling than pages of testimony. And in Flaxborough, a town priding itself on routine and propriety, such small deviations from order were as glaring as any crime scene. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight gleamed on the cobbles of Market Street, ordinary and bright, disguising the subtle stirrings of unrest beneath the veneer of everyday life. In Flaxborough, as always, appearances would hold at least until the truth, like a slow and courteous inspector, arrived at its own deliberate pace. Flaxborough awoke the following morning with the sort of discreet unease that is the hallmark of a town unused to disruption. The incident at the council meeting was quickly transformed from a trivial mishap into a matter of whispered speculation. By 9 o'clock, Mrs. Tilling had already recounted the episode to half a dozen acquaintances while rearranging her filing cabinet at home, each retelling gaining subtle embellishments. The smudge on the paper became a deliberate blot, Councillor Vernon's nervous glance a suspicious furtive action, and the clerk's apology a trembling admission of incompetence or guilt. The baker, Mr. Cray, who had an unparalleled capacity for overhearing anything in the market lanes, recounted the story to his assistant in tones of solemnity usually reserved for fires or floods. Fell from the table, he says. Cray mimicked the clerk's voice, shaking his head. A likely story. One can't help but wonder what was truly written in those minutes. I dare say someone may be trying to hide something, eh? Purbright, walking through the lanes to the station house, noted these murmurs with detached attention. It was not that he expected the story to contain factual detail. Indeed, he knew better, but the variations, the emphasis, and the slips of casual observation were all clues in themselves. Town gossip, properly interpreted, offered insight into priorities, fears, and ambitions, often far more reliably than any formal statement. By mid-morning, the matter had reached the post office, where Mrs. Pinnock, the postmistress, paused her sorting to relay the story to a customer buying stamps. A council minute, you say? And erased lines? Oh, it sounds almost scandalous. The customer, an elderly gentleman with a walking stick, tutted gravely. I never liked Vernon, he murmured. Always had a twitch about him. Perhaps this is finally evidence of something. Meanwhile, Purbright, sitting in his modest office with the faint smell of ink and tea, began his own careful inquiries. He wrote no notes yet. He merely allowed the events and recollections to settle in his mind, assembling them as one would a delicate puzzle. He had already determined that the smudge on the minutes could not be casual, that the fold across the paper was deliberate, and that the nervous behaviour he observed, though understated, indicated a fleeting attempt to obscure or manipulate. His first formal visit was to the council clerk herself. Mrs. Tilling received him with a polite, slightly distracted smile, as though she had been expecting him and was keen to demonstrate competence despite recent embarrassment. Inspector, I trust the matter has not caused undue concern, she said, placing her hands over the tidy stack of council files. Only the mildest of stirrings, Purbright replied gently, avoiding alarmist language. I was curious about the paper that fell yesterday. She hesitated, arranging her notes as if the precise positioning could clarify the past. A copy of last month's minutes. I'm not sure how it fell. I was checking them before filing and... Well, they simply slipped. I assure you no harm was intended. Purbright nodded, allowing the silence to linger. Of course. Yet I noticed some lines had been rewritten. Her fingers tightened around the papers. Just a small correction. A misrecorded comment by Councillor Bennet. Nothing significant. Really, Inspector, the whole affair is quite mundane, certainly. Yet sometimes mundane matters acquire a certain weight when observed in context, he said, his tone deliberately neutral. The careful phrasing was intended to encourage candidness without suggestion of accusation. Mrs. Tilling, after a pause, offered a faint sigh. Well, perhaps there were a few errors, as always happen in these minutes. People say one thing, mean another, and I record it as faithfully as possible. I can only hope no offence was caused. Purbright smiled lightly. No offence, Mrs. Tilling, but would you mind if I asked a few questions of your colleagues as well? By late morning, he had already interviewed Councillor Vernon, whose spectacles had developed a peculiar sheen from repeated polishing. Vernon insisted the minutes contained no material of consequence, though he admitted to noticing the smudge which he attributed to spilled ink from a pen he had left uncapped. One must be careful with fountain pens, he added, somewhat defensively. Purbright's observation noted more than his words. Vernon's knuckles were unusually tense, and his gaze darted toward the window when asked about his whereabouts during the moment of the paper's fall. Next, Purbright spoke with Councillor Bennet, the subject of the rewritten lines. Bennet, a corpulent man with a florid complexion, chuckled nervously. Ah, my comments? I often speak in a roundabout fashion. It is quite possible my words were misrepresented. But murder, Inspector? I hope you do not suspect such a thing. His jovial tone did not escape Purbright. He registered the faint tremor of concern beneath the laughter. By midday, Purbright had compiled a preliminary mental map of Flaxborough's web of interests and irritations. The clerk feared embarrassment. Vernon was defensive in a way that suggested more than simple distraction. Bennet sought amusement to mask unease, and the town at large had already invented multiple narratives. Each small interaction hinted at hidden rivalries, the petty resentment of Vernon toward Whitcomb for minor administrative slights, the historical annoyance of Bennet at procedural corrections, and Mrs. Tilling's quiet dread of being perceived as incompetent. Lunch at the station house was a solitary affair, interrupted only by the delivery of tea and a brief visit from Sergeant Crump, a young man with a penchant for accurate observation and silent loyalty. Crump, having overheard discussions in the marketplace, offered only a careful summary. "Town's talking, sir. Each person has a slightly different version. Nothing concrete, though some suspicions linger over Vernon. Others think it was simply carelessness." Purbright sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Indeed, and yet it is not always obvious who conceals the unusual motive. The subtleties often matter more than the proclamations." He returned to his notes, not on paper, but in the precise, ordered way of his mind, where observations, contradictions, and minor details could be examined, rearranged, and tested against one another. The afternoon brought a visit to the council chamber itself. Purbright lingered near the table, observing its polished surface and the precise alignment of chairs. The faint indentation of the dropped sheet, the residual blot of ink, and the slight curve of the fold were all quietly recorded in his memory. In the quiet room, the seemingly insignificant traces of yesterday's event revealed their full importance, the pattern of handling, the relative positions of individuals, and the invisible pressure exerted by office hierarchies. Even as he departed, heading back through the market lanes, Purbright noted the subtle variations in gossip, the glances exchanged in shop windows, and the mild exclamations of surprise over the story's embellishments. Each offered insight into the small town psyche, how fear, embarrassment, or curiosity could transform a minor incident into an event of considerable weight, all without raising voices or resorting to overt conflict. By early evening, Purbright returned to his office, where the sun fell at an angle that illuminated the faint dust motes and lent the room an almost contemplative glow. He considered the day's progress, the minutiae of rewritten council lines, the nervous glances of councillors, the whispering streets, and the delicate network of human behaviour in which the smudged sheet of paper had become a catalyst. It was in all respects a thoroughly ordinary day, yet the ordinary had already begun to conceal a quiet disturbance. The town's daily routines, from the bakery to the council chamber to the market lanes, were all slightly altered. One could detect it only in the small hesitations, the slight changes in tone, and the careful, polite attention that residents gave to one another's conduct. Purbright, for his part, allowed the observation to settle. Nothing was yet certain. No accusation had been made, no suspicion confirmed. But the small, seemingly trivial details, the smudge, the fold, the rewritten lines, were quietly coalescing into a framework of inquiry. And, as always, he knew that in Flaxborough it was only a matter of patience before the unremarkable would reveal the unusual. The following morning dawned with an unremarkable chill, and the streets of Flaxborough once again bustled with the usual small-town cadence, the rattling of carts, the chatter of market vendors, and the occasional bark of a dog pursuing some imagined mischief. Yet beneath the ordinary hum there lingered a subtle tension, a residue of curiosity and suspicion that had begun to take root. By now, the story of the fallen council minutes had travelled far beyond the walls of the town hall, and the focus had coalesced almost inevitably on Councillor Vernon. Vernon, for his part, displayed a particular blend of indignation and preemptive defensiveness. He arrived at the council chamber that morning with the careful precision of a man anticipating censure, though nothing formal had yet been suggested. As he passed through the market lanes, shopkeepers and passers-by exchanged glances and subtle nods, their whispered comments shaping a narrative of culpability without the need for confrontation. "There goes Vernon," muttered one elderly gentleman, wagging a finger. "I told you, something's off about him. Always twitching, always fidgeting." Inspector Purbright observed Vernon's journey with quiet detachment from a bench near the town library. He noted the councillor's measured steps, the occasional glance over the shoulder, and the hands that clutched the lapels of his coat as if warding off invisible scrutiny. These details, subtle and almost invisible to the casual observer, provided more insight than any direct testimony could. Purbright's first formal meeting of the day was with Vernon himself. He entered the councillor's modest office, a room lined with books on civil engineering and local history, and offered a polite nod. "Good morning, Councillor Vernon. I wondered if we might have a brief conversation regarding yesterday's incident." Vernon's spectacles caught the morning light, reflecting a glint of irritation beneath his practised civility. "Inspector," he began cautiously, "I trust this is merely procedural. There is nothing untoward here, I assure you. Just a minor mishap hardly deserving of attention." Purbright allowed the silence to extend as though weighing Vernon's words without comment. Indeed. Yet the fall of the minutes and the subsequent corrections, they invite certain questions. One might wonder how the smudge occurred and why the lines were rewritten. Vernon shifted in his chair, fingers drumming lightly against the desktop. "The ink, I suppose," he said vaguely. "Fountain pens are unpredictable. And as for the lines, errors, human error, that is all." Purbright's gaze lingered on him, noting the way Vernon avoided meeting his eyes directly. Human error is, of course, common, but it is the context that makes such errors. Curious. The fold, the placement, the choice of which lines to alter. Do you not find that all of this invites more than casual curiosity? Vernon cleared his throat, a slight flush colouring his cheeks. "Inspector, I do not see the point of scrutinizing every minor detail. Surely it is the outcome that matters. The minutes are correct and the council can proceed." "True," Purbright replied quietly. "But one cannot dismiss the signals hidden in the small deviations. Even trivial actions may indicate intention." His words, courteous yet pointed, lingered in the room like a slow, deliberate probe. Vernon's irritation deepened slightly, though he attempted to mask it with forced geniality. "I assure you, Inspector, my intentions are as unremarkable as the council itself. I see no motive for malfeasance or deception." "Nor would one expect there to be," Purbright said softly, rising from his chair. "Yet circumstances sometimes reveal more than declarations." He made no accusation, but his parting glance carried the quiet weight of observation. Vernon was left with an unsettling sense that every gesture, every hesitation, had been registered and catalogued. Later that morning, Purbright made his way to the local tea shop, a place where Flaxborough's social intricacies were on full display. Over steaming cups of tea and lightly buttered scones, townspeople recounted yesterday's events with embellishments that varied according to personal prejudice. Some viewed Vernon as a nervous conspirator, others suggested the clerk had been careless. Purbright listened patiently, noting the contradictions, the half-truths, and the inadvertent admissions that each retelling produced. Among those present was Miss Adeline Harewood, a retired schoolmistress with a penchant for incisive observation. She leaned forward conspiratorially. "It is not merely the smudge, Inspector," she said, lowering her voice. "It is the way Vernon fumbled when the paper fell. I have seen him handle documents before, and never like that. There is a hesitation, a self-consciousness that betrays him." Purbright inclined his head slightly as though acknowledging a general truth without committing to a judgment. "Yes," he said, "hints of hesitation can reveal more than confident declarations. Yet one must remain cautious. Appearances can be misleading." By mid-afternoon he had visited Councillor Whitcomb as well, ostensibly to discuss the council's upcoming schedule, but in reality to gather insights into the dynamics of his colleagues. Whitcomb's observations were subtle. Vernon, he noted, had always been attentive to personal detail, yet yesterday's behaviour had been peculiar, almost defensive. Whitcomb's words were not accusations but careful assessments, revealing alliances and underlying rivalries with a delicacy that suggested a deep understanding of Flaxborough's social lattice. Purbright's next move was to inspect the minutes themselves. In the quiet of his office, he spread the sheets across the desk, examining the smudges, the folds, and the carefully rewritten lines. The errors were plausible, almost trivial, but their placement and the timing of the correction suggested a deliberate touch, however slight. He considered the sequence of events, the paper falling unnoticed by most, Vernon's nervousness, the clerk's embarrassment, and the subtle exaggerations in town gossip. The web was simple yet intricate, revealing a first pattern without yet exposing a motive or a full explanation. It was enough to focus his attention, but not to precipitate judgment. Evening fell, and the market lanes emptied of pedestrians, leaving only the soft flicker of gas lamps and the distant barking of a dog. Purbright returned to his office, reviewing the day's observations. Vernon had emerged as the first suspect, not due to overt guilt, but because the circumstances had naturally pointed toward him. The errant paper, the rewritten lines, the visible nervousness, and the careful scrutiny of townspeople. Yet Purbright knew better than to rely solely on outward appearances. In Flaxborough, subtlety was the medium through which truth revealed itself, and he would allow the town's own social machinery to provide additional clues before drawing conclusions. The day had begun and ended with ordinary routine. Yet, beneath the familiar surfaces, the first threads of the mystery were taking hold. The town whispered, the minutes remained suspect, and Inspector Purbright, in his patient and unobtrusive fashion, quietly recorded everything, knowing that the seemingly obvious would rarely be the whole truth. By the next day, the council minutes had ceased to be the sole subject of gossip in Flaxborough. Nonetheless, their curious fall from the table had settled into the minds of a few more thoughtful residents, and, in Inspector Purbright's own, had become a small but persistent burr. The town, restless as ever for a narrative, had almost comfortably decided upon Vernon's guilt in the matter, if guilt could be ascribed to anything so modest as altering minutes, but Purbright himself, sitting with his morning tea, was unconvinced. It was not Vernon's nervousness that interested him most, nor Mrs. Tilling's flustered excuses, nor even the clerk's smudge of ink. What persisted in Purbright's mind was something he had observed almost accidentally, the faintest trace of a crease across the page, the kind of deliberate fold made by someone who wished to pocket it, not merely shuffle it amongst papers. He had seen Vernon's anxious polish of his spectacles, yes, and he had seen Bennet's broad attempt to laugh away the matter, yet it was the crease, like an invisible seam in the fabric of routine, that suggested more than clumsy handling. The town hall, when he visited again late that morning, bore no sign of disturbance. The varnished table shone, the chairs stood evenly aligned, and Mr. Beasley, the janitor, was once again sweeping with such energy that it seemed almost rehearsed. Purbright paused, watching the steady rhythm of broom against polished floor. There was a faint mark still visible near the spot where the sheet had fallen, a shallow impression, as if the pressure of the paper had briefly pressed against the wood. That was expected. What was less expected to Purbright's eye was a small, misplaced object half tucked beneath the skirting board nearby. A metal paperclip bent almost straight, its shape altered as though forced into use for something other than fastening. Purbright bent, retrieved it, and turned it over in his hand. He said nothing to Beasley, who glanced at him with the mild apprehension of a man whose work had been silently critiqued. The inspector pocketed the clip and allowed the janitor's sweeping to continue uninterrupted. Later that day, Purbright strolled into the market lanes again, his presence unremarkable, his gaze unassuming. The chatter of gossip had now evolved into speculation about motive. Some suggested Vernon wished to conceal a remark critical of his financial proposals. Others muttered that the clerk had been covering her own mistake, and a few, with relish, hinted that the mayor himself might prefer certain lines softened to avoid embarrassing reference to expenses. Overhearing such tales, Purbright reflected that the truth of small-town speculation often lay not in its accuracy, but in the eagerness with which certain people advanced particular theories. Mrs. Pinnock, for example, was quick to recount Vernon's supposed duplicity, but notably reluctant to mention her long-standing quarrel with his wife over a misdelivered parcel. Meanwhile, Miss Harewood was all too ready to stress Vernon's nervousness, though her own friendship with Bennet gave her every incentive to shift suspicion elsewhere. That evening, in his office, Purbright set the bent paperclip on the desk beside the suspect minutes. He regarded the two objects silently for several minutes, his expression one of mild contemplation. A smudged line, a deliberate fold, and a bent clip. Trifles, perhaps, but trifles with the unmistakable air of intent. Someone had altered the minutes, had meant to remove them or conceal them, and had failed at the crucial moment. He leaned back, recalling the expressions of each councillor during the meeting, replaying the sequence in quiet detail. Mrs. Tilling's fluster, Vernon's twitch, Bennet's forced laugh, Whitcomb's oddly measured calm. None was conclusive. All, however, were part of the delicate tapestry of concealment that Flaxborough wove so well. As he pondered, Sergeant Crump entered with his usual careful tread, holding a small notebook. "Sir," he said, "I thought it worth mentioning. Mr. Beasley, the janitor, was overheard saying in the pub last night that council business isn't all that tidy as it looks on paper." Folks laughed, but he went on to say he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to, though he didn't explain. Purbright raised an eyebrow, but his tone remained level. Beasley has sharp eyes, though he prefers the broom to the pen. Still, one must listen when he mutters. He gestured to the bent clip. and sometimes he leaves behind a hint of what he's seen without knowing it. Crump frowned at the object. "A paperclip, sir?" "Indeed," Purbright murmured, though one that has recently laboured beyond its intended purpose. "What puzzles me is not that it is bent, but what compelled someone to bend it. Curiosity, perhaps, or necessity." The sergeant nodded, though comprehension lagged. Purbright, with his usual patience, made no further explanation. Outside, the gas lamps flickered into life along Market Street, and the town settled once again into its evening quiet. Yet beneath the respectable hum of routine lay the sense that something more deliberate, more unsettling, had crept into Flaxborough's otherwise orderly affairs. What had begun as a smudged and folded paper was now joined by a bent clip and a janitor's indiscreet remark. Each triviality, insignificant in isolation, was quietly forming a pattern that only Purbright seemed inclined to see. And as he turned out the lamp in his office, leaving the minutes and the paperclip side by side on his desk, Purbright allowed himself the faintest smile. For in Flaxborough, it was the smallest of details that most reliably revealed the largest of truths. The following morning found Inspector Purbright strolling down Market Street at a pace calculated neither to attract attention nor to suggest any great urgency. It was a method he had perfected over years of service, to appear part of the landscape so that others revealed themselves more freely in his presence. The bent paperclip remained in his pocket, a small token of intrigue, but it was not the object itself that mattered. Rather, it was what it implied, an intention to meddle with documents, and in Flaxborough, meddling almost always concealed some quarrel, vanity, or advantage. By this time, Vernon's name had been circulated so liberally in gossip that even those who had never attended a council meeting spoke of him as the likely culprit. Yet Purbright, sipping tea in the station before setting out, had reminded himself that small-town certainty was often a fog under which the truth quietly hid. Vernon might indeed have tampered with the minutes, but what, precisely, was the benefit to him? The erasures had not obviously favoured him. If anything, they had merely softened a remark made by Councillor Bennet about allotment fees. It was too slight, too trivial, to risk embarrassment for. The inspector's inquiries broadened accordingly. His first call that day was on Councillor Bennet himself, who, despite his jovial manner, seemed rather more eager than necessary to explain the harmlessness of his original remark. "A little joke, Inspector, that's all it was. About nettles, you know, I may have said they were more efficiently managed by goats than by committee. Quite unimportant." Purbright gave a courteous nod, his gaze steady. "Humour, Councillor, is rarely unimportant in Flaxborough. One wonders who might have preferred it not be recorded." Bennet laughed, though with less conviction than before. Surely nobody would erase that, unless they had reason to feel that too much was being made of trivialities. "Indeed," Purbright murmured, filing away the discomfort behind Bennet's words. From Bennet he proceeded to call on Mr. Whitcomb, the chairman. Whitcomb, as always, was keen to demonstrate composure, but Purbright detected an unusual precision in his phrasing. "Our meetings, Inspector, must be recorded faithfully, of course. Yet sometimes the spirit of what is said matters more than the exact words. Accuracy can, after all, be achieved in more than one way." The inspector let the remark hover, seemingly satisfied, though inwardly it confirmed his suspicion. Whitcomb, like Bennet, had reason to prefer a certain tidiness in the record. Whitcomb's reputation, carefully maintained through years of civic devotion, relied upon meetings appearing orderly, respectable, untainted by remarks that might reflect untidiness of mind or tongue. To him, the minutes were less a record than a mirror. It was not only councillors who emerged under scrutiny. The janitor, Beasley, who until now had seemed little more than a bystander, revealed, through repeated indiscretion at the pub, that he had overheard more than was proper. Purbright sent Sergeant Crump to sit with him one evening over a pint, knowing the man would speak more freely in such company. Crump returned with the report that Beasley had heard voices raised in low argument in the council chamber after a meeting some weeks before, though he was unwilling or perhaps unable to identify the parties. The quarrel, he claimed, concerned what ought or ought not to be in the minutes. This scrap of hearsay, flimsy though it might seem, fitted neatly alongside the bent clip and the folded page. It suggested not a sudden accident, but an ongoing concern with appearances and possibly with concealment. In the meantime, Mrs. Tilling continued her work as clerk with a faint air of martyrdom, as if the town's speculation had cast her in the role of victim. When Purbright called upon her again, she presented herself with almost defiant neatness, her files stacked precisely, her pens aligned as though to testify to her reliability. "I have been the subject of enough idle chatter, Inspector," she said, with a thin smile. "Surely you do not think I would alter the record to save myself embarrassment?" Purbright replied with his usual courtesy. "Embarrassment is rarely sufficient motive, Mrs. Tilling, but reputations can sometimes encourage extraordinary measures." He left her with that thought, observing the faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted the papers. The day drifted into evening, and as Purbright walked once more along the cobbled lanes, he considered the widening circle of possibilities. Vernon remained the obvious suspect, but Bennet's unease, Whitcomb's careful phrasing, Beasley's indiscretion, and the clerk's defensive posture all suggested a more complex tangle of interests. The smudge, the fold, and the bent clip were no longer solitary curiosities, but part of a pattern hinting at something larger than a simple clerical mishap. The gossip of Flaxborough, too, was beginning to shift. While some still pointed the finger at Vernon, others had begun to suggest alternative narratives. Miss Harewood, for instance, now hinted that Whitcomb had reasons of his own for suppressing certain remarks, though she declined to elaborate. Mr. Cray at the bakery claimed that Bennet had been unusually generous with his purchases lately, perhaps to sweeten his public image. And Mrs. Pinnock at the post office was certain the clerk was hiding something, though her certainty appeared rooted more in personal prejudice than in evidence. Purbright listened to all of it, patient and attentive, weaving the strands into a net that might, at the right moment, reveal the truth. He knew the next step would not be a direct accusation, but the gentle, deliberate widening of his inquiry to draw out the concealed motives beneath the surface. For in Flaxborough it was not the crime itself that shocked, but the revelation of the petty vanities and rivalries that had compelled it. The inspector returned to his desk at the station, set the bent paperclip beside the minutes once more, and allowed his gaze to rest on them as the lamplight deepened into evening. A smudged line, a fold, a bent clip, an overheard quarrel. Trifles, yes. But in their accumulation lay the shape of a truth that could not yet be spoken. The following week began with a sense of uneasy quiet, as if the town had temporarily exhausted itself with speculation. Vernon still bore the brunt of disapproving looks in the marketplace, though he now carried himself with a deliberate air of innocence that was almost as incriminating as guilt. Whitcomb's calm demeanour, Bennet's bluster, and Mrs. Tilling's defensive neatness each persisted, and yet nothing in their outward behaviour provided Purbright with a decisive lead. He had resigned himself, for the moment, to patience. That patience was rewarded on a Tuesday afternoon when another disturbance occurred, small in appearance but significant in consequence. A package, addressed to the council clerk, was delivered to the town hall. Beasley, ever dutiful, carried it in and placed it upon Mrs. Tilling's desk. She opened it in full view of several councillors, only to find inside a thick envelope of papers tied with string. The top sheet bore the words "Original Draft Minutes" in a hand distinctly different from her own. Beneath were pages containing not merely corrections, but entire passages omitted from the official record. The room fell into silence, broken only by Bennet's sharp intake of breath. His own name appeared frequently in the draft, attached to remarks considerably less flattering than those recorded. There were also notes about Whitcomb's expense proposals, phrased with uncharacteristic frankness, and most strikingly, there was a passage in which Vernon was accused, though not by name, of manipulating figures to suit a private interest. The councillors reacted with a mixture of outrage and embarrassment. Mrs. Tilling, pale, insisted she had never seen these drafts before. Vernon, flushed, denied everything in a tone so vehement that it only deepened suspicion. Whitcomb attempted to restore order, but his assurances sounded hollow. In the end, it was Purbright who stepped forward, retrieving the package with quiet authority and carrying it away without explanation. In his office later, he examined the documents carefully. The handwriting, though disguised, was neat and deliberate. The paper was identical to that used for official council records, suggesting it had been obtained from the same store cupboard. The alterations, however, told their own story. Someone had wished not only to conceal remarks, but also to reshape the entire record of the meeting. Where the official minutes offered an innocuous summary, these drafts hinted at quarrels, slights, and even financial irregularities. The second incident transformed the inquiry. What had begun as a smudged sheet and a bent clip was now clearly more than clumsiness. Someone had both motive and opportunity to manipulate the written record. Yet the arrival of the package was also peculiar. Why reveal the drafts at all? To expose another? To misdirect suspicion? Or was it the work of someone who had lost their nerve and sought to distance themselves from guilt by creating confusion? As Purbright considered these questions, Crump entered with news from the post office. Mrs. Pinnock recalled that the package had been dropped through the council's mail slot during the night, not delivered by post. That small detail, easily overlooked, suggested someone local, someone with access to the town hall after hours, or someone prepared to risk discovery. The inspector's thoughts returned to Beasley, who alone had routine access after hours, though his sweeping rarely extended to nocturnal duties. He also considered Vernon, who had keys as a councillor. And then there was Mrs. Tilling, who would, by virtue of her position, have access whenever needed. In short, several had the opportunity. But who had the motive? The draft minutes revealed more than careless record-keeping. They pointed to petty rivalries, political manoeuvring, and perhaps even financial impropriety. If genuine, they were dangerous to reputations. If fabricated, they were dangerous still, for they indicated a deliberate attempt to discredit. That evening, the gossip in the town revived with fresh vigour. The package had been mentioned to too many for secrecy to hold. In the tea shop, voices lowered but grew sharper. "If those drafts are true," said Miss Harewood, "then Vernon has more to answer for than mere nervousness." Others countered that it was Bennet who stood exposed, his buffoonery made into ridicule on paper. And a few whispered that Whitcomb himself might be the ultimate target, his expense proposals set in a light that undermined his dignified chairmanship. Purbright let the gossip run its course, noting who pushed which interpretation, and how strongly. It was less the content of the rumours than the eagerness with which they were repeated that interested him. Every person had a version that suited their prejudice. Every version revealed more about the speaker than about the truth. As the day drew to a close, Purbright sat once more at his desk, the draft minutes spread before him. The bent clip still lay nearby, its mute testimony unchanged. But now it joined a larger narrative, a deliberate attempt to conceal, followed by a deliberate attempt to reveal. The town hall, outwardly respectable, had become the stage for an invisible contest of motives, each polite face masking a private anxiety. The inspector leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The second incident had shifted the ground entirely. No longer was this a matter of a smudged sheet or a nervous counsellor. It was now a question of who, in Flaxborough, had most to lose from the truth, and who stood to gain from confusion. The days following the arrival of the mysterious package were marked by an uneasy civility that hung over Flaxborough like mist on the riverbank. The councillors went about their business with a greater than usual show of orderliness, nodding to one another in the street with forced cheer, while the townspeople whispered more quietly, as if wary of being overheard by the very subjects of their gossip. For Inspector Purbright, the matter had shifted into a deeper phase. The surface details had been gathered, the gossip sifted, and now the question was no longer what had happened, but why. He sat alone in his office one evening, the draft minutes and the bent paperclip spread before him. The lamplight caught the faint smudge across one page, the deliberate fold, and the careful but unnatural corrections. The anonymous package, so theatrically timed, suggested not one simple act, but a contest of wills. Someone had wished to hide the truth, and then someone, perhaps the same person, had wished to expose it. Or, more troubling still, someone had planted the exposure in order to shift suspicion elsewhere. Purbright reflected, not for the first time, on the curious tendency of human beings to hide trifles with a zeal far greater than that with which they might conceal serious crimes. In towns like Flaxborough, reputation was both currency and shield. A councillor might endure whispers of dishonesty in money matters, but would bristle at being thought ridiculous in the council chamber. A clerk could forgive being thought inefficient in arithmetic, but not being seen as careless in her record. And a chairman like Whitcomb would go to extraordinary lengths to preserve the illusion of unruffled dignity. The inspector leaned back, listening to the faint tick of the clock. To him, the second incident did not erase the first, rather it magnified it. The smudged and folded page was now joined by a set of drafts that showed a deliberate shaping of the record. The bent paperclip, once a curiosity, could well have been the tool used to prise open a drawer or force a lock. And Beasley's mutterings of overheard argument no longer sounded like pub exaggeration, but the muffled echo of a real quarrel behind council doors. It was in the pattern of concealment that Purbright found his interest sharpening. If Vernon had wished to hide Bennet's jokes at his expense, why would Bennet be so eager to laugh them away? If Whitcomb had sought to suppress frank remarks about expenses, why allow the drafts to surface now? And if Mrs. Tilling had simply corrected errors, how had an entirely different set of drafts appeared in her post? The threads wove themselves not into a simple knot, but a tangle, each loop concealing another. His thoughts turned to the town itself. Flaxborough was a place where secrets were rarely hidden for long, but they were often distorted, like reflections in a pond. Everyone saw something, yet no one saw the whole. Gossip was less a matter of truth than of emphasis, and it was in emphasis that motives declared themselves. Purbright had long since learned that to understand a crime in Flaxborough, one must not only listen to what people said, but note what they avoided saying, what they hesitated over, and what they repeated with unnecessary conviction. At the tea shop the following day, Miss Harewood was particularly sharp in her opinions, describing Vernon's protestations as the squeaking of a guilty conscience. Yet she did not dwell on Bennet, her old friend, whose name had appeared so unflatteringly in the drafts. Whitcomb, overheard later in conversation outside the library, dismissed the whole affair as clerical confusion, but added, with unusual firmness, that the council's honour must be preserved at all costs. Such phrasing, Purbright mused, revealed not only concern but fear that honour, once doubted, could not be easily restored. Back in his office, he made no notes, for he preferred to carry the details in his head where they could shift and rearrange themselves freely. He pictured the council chamber on the day of the first incident, Vernon's twitch, the clerk's fluster, Whitcomb's stillness, Beasley's broom moving rhythmically in the background. Then he layered upon it the second, the sudden package, the faces palling as the drafts were revealed, the calculated denials. 2 moments linked not by accident, but by intention. It was in these reflections that Purbright began to sense the outline of his next move. The guilty party, whether Vernon, Bennet, Whitcomb, or another altogether, would not confess under direct questioning. But they might, if nudged at the right angle, betray themselves through over-eagerness, or through the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. For now, though, he allowed the matter to rest in thought. The papers lay on his desk, mute witnesses to vanity, rivalry, and fear. The town, outwardly peaceful, buzzed with unseen currents, and Inspector Purbright, patient as ever, prepared himself for the gentle but deliberate probe that would, in time, bring the truth to light. The following afternoon, Purbright made a point of walking once more to the town hall, though this time not for the purpose of any formal interview. He moved at the same deliberate pace he always adopted, the sort that seemed to give every errand equal weight, whether it concerned a missing bicycle or, as in this case, the concealed motives of councillors. He stopped at the foot of the wide steps, greeted Beasley with a nod, and passed inside. The council chamber was empty, the light falling at a slant across the long table, its surface gleaming with a polish that seemed almost defensive in its perfection. He sat for a while at the end of the table where the minutes had first fallen, picturing the scene again with the precise eye of memory. Vernon shifting uneasily, Mrs. Tilling bending to retrieve the page, Bennet chuckling, Whitcomb smoothing his papers, Beasley's broom rhythmically moving. He imagined the moments just before and just after, the gestures people made when they thought they were unseen. It was often in such recollections that small truths revealed themselves. Later, as he strolled back into Market Street, Purbright found the town had already supplied new layers of interpretation to the discovery of the drafts. Vernon was still the favourite target of gossip, but Bennet was now mentioned more openly as someone who might have had reason to suppress his own blunders. Some speculated the drafts were Whitcomb's doing, his way of tidying records to protect the council's image. And of course, there were those who suspected Mrs. Tilling herself, convinced that clerks always had more power than they cared to admit. In the tea shop, Purbright quietly listened. Miss Harewood, brimming with certainty, leaned forward and declared that the handwriting on the drafts looked suspiciously male, a remark of little forensic value, yet revealing her willingness to excuse Mrs. Tilling. Mr. Cray, meanwhile, insisted that no woman of Tilling's pride would permit her work to be altered without resistance, so she must have been complicit. Others nodded gravely at whichever opinion seemed most in tune with their own prejudices. Purbright drank his tea, his expression unchanged, but the subtleties of these exchanges slid neatly into his mind. He noted not merely what was said, but the emphasis, the eagerness to shield one and condemn another, and the way Flaxborough's small web of alliances showed itself in casual sentences. That evening, back in his office, he unfolded the draft minutes once more, setting them beside the bent clip and the smudged page. A line of thought had begun to form, faint but persistent. It was not the supposed scandal about expenses or nettles that intrigued him. Those were almost too obvious. Rather, it was the curious fact that someone had taken the trouble to remove a set of drafts and then later, equally deliberately, return them in a package. The two acts did not align unless one accepted that the drafts had been used, first as a tool of concealment and then as a weapon of exposure. He considered the councillors one by one. Vernon's nervousness remained suspect, but his panic seemed more the panic of being suspected than of guilt. Bennet's laughter was brittle, and though his vanity made him vulnerable, he was too careless for forgery. Whitcomb had both the composure and the motive, for he lived by appearances, but he also had a peculiar faith in the endurance of appearances. And Mrs. Tilling, meticulous, anxious, deeply sensitive to criticism, had the most direct opportunity of all. It was in this balance of traits that Purbright saw the shape of human nature revealing itself. Concealment was rarely a matter of great design. It was born of petty vanities, of the desire to avoid ridicule or to polish an image. The drafts had been hidden because they contained words someone could not bear to see recorded. They had been returned because someone else, or perhaps the same someone, could not bear the weight of holding them. The very act of exposure suggested a guilty conscience seeking relief. The inspector rose, closed the files, and walked to the window. Outside, the lamplight glowed faintly against the mist. The town seemed serene, but he knew the calm was deceptive. Beneath it lay a network of unease, councillors glancing at one another with suspicion, townsfolk repeating gossip with relish, and an unspoken dread that something more than mere embarrassment might yet be uncovered. Purbright smiled faintly, almost indulgently. The case, as far as he was concerned, was not about the minutes at all. It was about the people who lived by them, and what their small quarrels revealed when pressed. The truth would come, not in a shout or a confession, but in the quiet slip of a phrase, the over-anxious defence, the silence where there should have been an explanation. All he needed was to set his quiet net, woven of ordinary questions and ordinary pauses, and let Flaxborough's restless conscience ensnare itself. The next morning, with his plan quietly forming, Inspector Purbright stepped into the crisp air of Market Street with the same unhurried pace as always. Yet beneath his calm manner there was a deliberate focus, for he knew the next stage would be less about gathering rumours and more about prodding gently at the places where conscience was most tender. The bent clip, the folded page, the smudged line, the hidden drafts. Each was now less a clue than a lever, and he intended to apply just enough pressure to see who would move. By the time another council meeting was convened, Inspector Purbright had determined that his moment for quiet intervention had arrived. He had spent the previous days listening more than speaking, allowing Flaxborough's gossip to build its own elaborate edifice of suspicion, while he carefully noted its cracks. What lingered with him most was not the talk itself, but the tones in which it was delivered, the eagerness to accuse, the hesitations that betrayed unease, the strained cheerfulness that concealed dread. All were threads, and he had only to tug them gently. The councillors assembled that evening with more stiffness than usual. Even the mayor, ordinarily buoyant in his ceremonial chair, looked somewhat diminished, while Whitcomb, presiding as chairman, projected calmness so carefully that it seemed almost theatrical. Mrs. Tilling sat with her stack of papers aligned to the millimetre, her lips pressed tightly together. Vernon polished his spectacles with exaggerated care, and Bennet produced chuckles that sounded oddly brittle. Purbright did not sit at the back as he usually did. Instead, he chose a chair at the side of the chamber, not in their circle, but near enough to be seen. His presence was unremarked aloud, yet every councillor seemed more conscious of their posture, their tone, their papers. The agenda began in the usual fashion: allotment fees, municipal lighting, a brief note on refuse collection. But Purbright, after a pause in proceedings, interjected with mild politeness. "If I may, Mr. Chairman, I would like to inquire about the council minutes. There has been some confusion over earlier drafts, and I believe it is in everyone's interest to ensure the record is clear." The words, spoken without accusation, hung heavily. Mrs. Tilling's hand trembled ever so slightly on her pen. Vernon's spectacles misted as though from sudden heat. Bennet gave a laugh that turned into a cough, and Whitcomb, his face unchanging, inclined his head. "Of course, Inspector, the minutes will be read as usual." Mrs. Tilling, with visible effort, read aloud the official version. Each word sounded deliberate, as though chosen to defy scrutiny. When she had finished, Purbright leaned forward, his expression calm. "And do we consider these an accurate reflection of our last meeting?" There was silence, broken only by Vernon's muttering, "Naturally," followed quickly by Bennet's. "I see no reason to doubt it," Whitcomb added. "They are satisfactory," in a tone of finality. Only Mrs. Tilling said nothing, her eyes fixed on the page. Purbright let the silence grow uncomfortable before speaking again, his voice light but clear. "It is curious, then, that other versions exist. Versions with rather more colour. Some of you have seen them. Some of you perhaps have written them. But what interests me most is not the words themselves, but the anxiety they have produced." He folded his hands on the table, his gaze steady but never sharp. Anxiety, after all, is often the clearest sign of truth. Whitcomb shifted in his chair, the calm mask slipping just enough to betray discomfort. Vernon muttered something about slanderous inventions. Bennet chuckled nervously, and Mrs. Tilling finally spoke, her voice thin. "Inspector, if drafts have circulated, I cannot account for it. My duty has always been to provide an orderly and faithful record." "Orderly, yes," Purbright said gently. "Faithful, perhaps less so. The difficulty lies not in a single mistake, but in the deliberate effort to make what was untidy appear respectable. A fold in a page, a smudge of ink, a bent paperclip. Such small things speak volumes." He did not accuse directly, he never did. Instead, he allowed the implication to settle, his words drifting like a quiet draught into each councillor's conscience. The meeting continued, but uneasily, with every item clouded by the unspoken question of who among them had tampered with the record. Afterwards, as they filed out, Purbright remained behind, speaking casually with Beasley, who hovered with his broom as if to remind the councillors that nothing escaped the janitor's notice. "It is remarkable," Purbright murmured to him, "how much paper tells us when folded one way or another, but it is the hands that fold it which interest me most." Beasley nodded, pleased to have been included in confidence, though without fully grasping its meaning. That night, back in his office, Purbright allowed himself a quiet reflection. His words at the meeting had not solved the matter, but they had unsettled it, and that was his intention. In Flaxborough, truth was rarely dragged into daylight. It was coaxed, lured out by the gentle prodding of conscience. Already he had seen who fidgeted, who grew pale, who laughed too much. He knew that the next step would be decisive, a setting, calm and civil, in which the guilty would find themselves unable to maintain the mask. For now, though, he sat in silence, the minutes and the bent clip once again before him, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. His test had been set in motion, and in the days to come it would tell him all he needed. In the days that followed his quiet intervention at the council meeting, Inspector Purbright observed a change in the atmosphere of Flaxborough. The councillors, who had once taken pleasure in the ceremonial trivialities of their office, now seemed to carry themselves with the guarded air of defendants awaiting cross-examination. Vernon avoided the marketplace altogether, preferring to send his wife for groceries. Bennet, uncharacteristically subdued, offered none of his usual booming laughter. Whitcomb remained polished, but there was a tautness in his manner, as though his chairmanship had grown heavier. Mrs. Tilling, pale and drawn, was seen leaving the town hall late at night with papers clasped tightly to her chest, her lips pressed thin in a line of worry. Purbright himself did nothing to hasten matters. His method was never to force but to wait, to allow guilt to become intolerable under its own weight. Yet he arranged with the subtlest of nudges for circumstances to draw the guilty into the open. He spoke with Beasley in the corridor about odd things left out of drawers. He remarked casually in the tea shop that handwriting, even disguised, often betrayed the hand that wrote it. He asked Mrs. Pinnock whether parcels left in the council slot might be seen by others. Each remark, delivered without emphasis, travelled further than any direct accusation could. The effect was gradual but sure. A rumour took hold that the inspector already knew who had altered the minutes, that he was merely biding his time until the council's next gathering to announce it. People repeated this with a kind of thrill, as though awaiting a theatrical performance. The councillors themselves, hearing the whispers, grew ever more nervous. In Flaxborough, the expectation of exposure was often more damaging than exposure itself. Purbright noticed particularly how Mrs. Tilling began to fray. Once so careful in her precision, she now betrayed slips of manners, papers stacked unevenly, her voice faltering during a reading, a touch of defensiveness when asked about minor errors. She insisted with almost comic intensity that every line was exact, every note correct. The insistence itself became suspicious. In her desire to appear unimpeachable, she revealed the very fear of being found otherwise. Yet Purbright also observed that Whitcomb, for all his polish, had grown curiously attentive to the inspector's movements. On one occasion, passing in the street, he stopped to remark too casually that some things are better left to fade, Inspector. The council's harmony depends on it. To which Purbright had replied, smiling faintly, "Harmony, Mr. Whitcomb, often requires one honest note to tune the rest." The chairman's lips had tightened, and he had walked away. The net was drawing close, not through confrontation, but through silence, pauses, and the careful placing of words. The town itself now waited for the outcome, convinced that some revelation was imminent. Purbright could feel the tension in the air, as tangible as the damp mist that lingered over the cobbles at dusk. It was time, he knew, to bring the matter to a civil close, not with drama, but with the calm explanation that Flaxborough's peculiar conscience required. He decided that the next meeting would provide the perfect stage. There would be no accusations shouted across the chamber, no thumping of tables. Instead, he would quietly lay out what the smudges, the folds, the bent paperclip, and the drafts revealed when seen together. He would explain how anxiety betrayed itself, how appearances had been tidied not for corruption, but for fear of embarrassment. And he would show as gently as possible whose hand had done the tidying, and why. That evening, alone in his office, he reviewed the evidence one last time. Each clue seemed trivial, even laughable, a crease, a smudge, a bent clip. Yet together they told a story of human frailty, of the desire to hide small failings behind a mask of respectability. The murder of truth, Purbright mused, was often a quieter thing than the murder of flesh. Yet in Flaxborough it was no less consequential. For reputation once pierced could not easily be mended. He extinguished the lamp and left the papers neatly on his desk, knowing he would require them soon. The final act was near, and it would unfold with all the quiet inevitability of a council motion carried without dissent. The council chamber, on the evening of the next meeting, bore an air of unease that no amount of polish or procedural formality could dispel. The councillors took their seats with the careful composure of people trying to appear more at ease than they were. The mayor adjusted his chain of office. Bennet tugged at his collar. Vernon fussed with his spectacles. Whitcomb arranged his notes in faultless symmetry. And Mrs. Tilling, pale and rigid, sat behind her neat stack of files. Only Beasley, sweeping with a steady rhythm at the back, seemed immune to the weight of expectation. Inspector Purbright, calm as ever, occupied his usual place, though this time he was not content to observe silently. After the first few items of business lighting, allotments, a brief note on paving repairs, he cleared his throat with quiet deliberation. "Before we continue," he said, his voice courteous but firm, "it may be of service to all present if I clarify the matter of the minutes. Their treatment has caused considerable speculation. I would like to explain what has occurred." A hush fell over the chamber. Vernon gripped his spectacles. Bennet gave a nervous cough. Whitcomb's jaw tightened, and Mrs. Tilling's eyes flicked to the papers before her. Purbright unfolded a single sheet. The first incident, you will recall, was a page that slipped to the floor. At first sight it appeared unremarkable. Yet it bore 3 marks of significance: a deliberate fold, a smudge of ink inconsistent with careless handling, and a set of lines rewritten in a different hand. It suggested that someone had altered the record, then tried clumsily to restore it. The second incident was the anonymous package, the so-called original drafts. Its intention was clear: to unsettle, to accuse, to spread suspicion. But its very manner of delivery late at night through the council slot told us more than its contents. For only someone with constant access to the chamber, someone who handled the papers daily, could both remove and replace them with such ease. He paused, his gaze moving lightly across the table. No one spoke. Even Beasley had stopped sweeping. "It is tempting," Purbright went on, "to see in these alterations a plot of great significance: corruption, concealment, conspiracy. But in truth, the motive was smaller, more human. It was not money that was protected, nor power. It was pride." He turned his gaze to Mrs. Tilling, his tone still gentle. "You are meticulous, madam. Too meticulous, perhaps, to allow the official record to bear the occasional foolishness or quarrel of councillors. You sought to tidy their words, to make the council appear dignified, and when the first alteration threatened discovery, you panicked. You folded the page, you smudged the ink, you tried to erase and rewrite. Then later, driven by fear of exposure, you placed the drafts in the post, hoping the confusion would scatter suspicion wider." Mrs. Tilling's hands, resting on the files, trembled. A faint colour rose in her cheeks, and she opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Around the table, the councillors shifted uneasily, each realizing in turn that they had been both the beneficiaries and the victims of her anxious corrections. "It was a small deception," Purbright said, his voice as mild as ever. "Born not of malice, but of the ordinary human dread of ridicule. In seeking to spare the council embarrassment, you created a far greater one. Yet the truth is less dramatic than rumour has made it. There is no fraud, no grand plot. Only a clerk who valued the town's respectability too highly to trust it to chance. The silence that followed was heavy, though not hostile. Vernon's shoulders slumped in relief. Bennet gave a small laugh of sympathy. Whitcomb allowed himself a sigh. And Mrs. Tilling, though tears glistened in her eyes, managed a faint nod, as if accepting that her secret burden had at last been named. The meeting continued, subdued but calmer, with the minutes accepted as read unaltered this time. Beasley resumed his sweeping, the scrape of broom against floor, sounding almost like a closing act. Later, as Purbright walked back to the station through the misty lanes, the town already buzzed with the muted retelling of events. Some would paint Mrs. Tilling as foolish, others as misguidedly noble. Most would simply move on, content to let gossip fold the truth into a shape that suited their talk. At his desk, Purbright placed the bent paperclip back in his drawer and closed it softly. The case had resolved itself not with drama, but with the quiet revelation of ordinary vanity, as so many of Flaxborough's mysteries did. And tomorrow the business of the town would continue. Allotments, lighting, paving repairs, and all the other trifles through which human pride and folly so reliably made themselves known.